One of these days, we will be able to travel freely again. I don't know when exactly, but it will happen eventually. I'm sure of it. And when it does, I hope that some of you will make a pilgrimage to the Holy Land of Israel and Palestine to visit and pray at the holiest places of the Christian faith. The major destination of any Holy Land pilgrimage is Jerusalem. And to get there from here, you have to fly to Ben Gurion Airport in Tel Aviv, then rent a car or take a taxi half an hour to Jerusalem. The city of Jerusalem does not have an international airport. There are historical and geopolitical reasons for that, but another reason, one that becomes clear as soon as you're about halfway on the drive, is that Jerusalem is in the middle of the Judean hill country. There's hardly any flat land for miles. We're not talking about gently rolling hills either. Jerusalem is the highest point in the area. The Bible often talks about going up to Jerusalem because it is uphill from everywhere. And as you are climbing the road from the highway, the landscape alongside the road goes up and down, with houses clinging to hillsides and deep ravines cutting through the terrain. Creating enough flat ground for a runway would be a massive, extremely expensive project. The image of a highway in the wilderness, a highway for God and of God, comes up again and again in the Bible. The prophet Isaiah is best known for it. This Isaiah, the second prophet to use that name, was writing about 550 years before the birth of Jesus. His people, the people of Judah, had lost a war against the Babylonian Empire. And for 45 years, the survivors of Judah lived in exile in Babylon. But now the Babylonian Empire was crumbling, and the new power, Persia, was letting the exiles return to Judah. They were 1,000 miles from home, 1,000 miles of desert and wild animals and little food and water, and the up and down, the constant up and down of the hills and valleys. They longed to go back home, but the prospect of the journey was daunting, to say the least. My husband Melville happens to be an avid hill walker. To Americans, hill walking sounds like a gentle stroll on a manicured trail, but in Scotland it is a strenuous pursuit, off trails, in frequently changing weather, on varied terrain that includes climbing up and down rock and scrambling over loose scree. It's actually not that different from hiking in the Judean hill country. Melville has taught me a couple of things about traveling up and down steep hills. First, it's dangerous. The hospital in Fort William, a city nestled among the Scottish hills, has world-class expertise in treating climbing injuries because accidents are so frequent. Most accidents happen on descent because you're fighting against gravity. Gravity wants to accelerate you down quickly, but it's much safer to go down slowly and carefully. And second, hill walking is exhausting. It takes a lot more energy to climb up and down a hill than it does to walk along a level path. And it takes more time. The hill walker's rule of thumb is that every 1,000 feet of ascent adds half an hour to your travel time. And that's for a healthy, fit person with proper boots and good equipment. So imagine the exiles facing that 1,000-mile walk back to Jerusalem from Babylon. Healthy, fit young people, and also toddlers, older people with worn-out knees and unsteady feet, pregnant women, all of them carrying their clothes and food on their backs. And they had to walk all that way, up and down, getting tireder and more prone to falling with each hill they faced. As joyful as the exiles were about returning home, they must have thought they'd never make it. Isaiah proclaims that God is coming to guide the exiles back to Judah. He promises that the journey will be long, yes, It will be tiring. But the walk will be on a new level road. For God is making a highway in the wilderness for God's people. Every mountain and hill shall be made low. Every valley shall be filled in. Every crooked path shall be made straight. Every rough and rutted path, every spot where tired feet stumble over craggy ground shall be made smooth. And as the exiles travel God's highway, they shall see, all people, Gentiles as well as Jews, shall see the salvation of God. Imagine what building this highway would take in the pre-industrial world. There were no bulldozers, no dump trucks or excavators in Isaiah's time, just oxen, carts, and hand tools. For every everlasting hill made low, millions of people hours with shovels, digging and digging until their hands blister, then bleed, then form tough calluses. For every valley lifted up, thousands of cartloads of dirt hauled by oxen, millions more hours to unload the dirt, pack it down to make a stable surface, cut ditches to carry rainwater away. For every crooked path made straight, thousands of pairs of sandals worn through, thousands of aching backs and sore shoulders. For every rough way made smooth, billions of calories to feed the laborers and keep their energy up. All this labor repeated thousands of times over the course of the road as it makes its way through the Judean hill country. God does it gladly, out of love for God's people. This is what God is willing to do to bring God's people safely home. And the exiles did return safely home. They made that long 1,000-mile walk through the wilderness and got back to Jerusalem. Yet the new Judah was different from the old one. The exiles came home to a changed land as changed people. They rebuilt houses and shops destroyed in the war. They rebuilt the temple, but it was still different than it used to be. And the exiles were different, more resilient, with that combination of cynicism and hope you see in survivors of trauma. They'd been torn from their land once, and they knew it could happen again. They had learned to live with uncertainty about the future. What they did know, what they were sure of because they'd experienced it, was that God had prepared them for this journey. God had prepared the way for this journey. Perhaps it was an actual highway in the desert. Perhaps the highway was metaphorical. Regardless, the exiles knew that God had smoothed the way for their return. This image of God's highway in the wilderness proved to be a powerful one for God's people. So powerful, they kept returning to it in times of disruption and dispersion. A few hundred years after Isaiah, the scribe Baruch proclaimed to Jews scattered around the Mediterranean that God was again making a way home to Jerusalem. Baruch's generation had been led away by their enemies, but God would bring them back, carried on a throne as if they were royalty. God had ordered that every mountain and hill be made low, and the valleys filled up to make level ground, so that God's people could walk safely in the glory of God. God would lead them personally. God would not delegate this to a human guide. Baruch promised that God, God's self, would walk with God's people. The glory of God would light the path for them and make their footsteps sure. Still later, the gospel writer Luke looked back to Isaiah to proclaim to Gentile Christians, scattered and afraid, that God was coming to them in the person of Jesus Christ. Luke put John the Baptist in Isaiah's role, preparing the way of the Lord, filling every valley, making low every mountain and hill, making straight the crooked ways, and making smooth the rough ways. "Get ready," John the Baptist cried, For God is traveling this highway in the wilderness to get to you. God the shepherd, who carries the lambs in God's arms and gently leads the mother sheep, will bring you safely home. That is how much God loves you. You matter that much to God. And all flesh, Gentiles and Christians and Jews alike, will see the salvation of God. We might relate to the exiles coming home to a changed land as changed people. We're different than we were 2 long years ago when the first case of COVID-19 was diagnosed. Different in ways we recognize, and different in ways that won't become clear until much later. We don't know exactly what the post-pandemic world will be like yet, but the journey to get there is daunting. There are everlasting hills and valleys and crooked paths and rough ways between here and there. There's no trail, there's no map. We have to set our own path through the wilderness. And we are already so tired. We think about going up and down, and we're not sure we can make it. Yet even now, God is smoothing the way for us. God is going to the extraordinary effort of building a smooth, level, straight highway through the wilderness for us to travel in safety. God loves us that much. We matter that much to God. As we move further into the season of Advent, we can pay attention to God's construction work in our lives. Where do we notice the hills becoming easier to scale, the ravines becoming safer to descend? How is the path that seemed crooked and rough becoming straight and smooth? Where is God making a highway in the wilderness for you?